All right, here we are with another episode of the High Ground, powered by Premier Company. Sal, how's it going?
Doing wonderful today.
Good. Hey, Glenn Longabaugh is back with us. He is on the road in this busy time of year, which it seems like the way they're hitting it, it's probably closer to maybe the 1st of June than it is the 1st of May. But we've had a big spring, and that's why we've got you on, Glenn. We want to talk a little bit about that. But before we get started, you have a question of the day to answer.
Oh, forgot about that.
So, Glenn, your question of the day is, what is the one productivity tool that you could not live without, and what makes it indispensable to you?
Yeah, you're going to qualify that a little bit. When you say productivity tool, are we talking like software or are we talking hardware, right?
I'll
No,
let you
I don't-
pick.
I think it's
it could be
open.
an iPhone or a shovel in your job. I'm not sure. So you pick
Well,
it.
yeah. So I mean, an iPhone. If you're talking about hardware, then it's all about iPhones and that sort of thing. Uh, I guess the first thing came to my mind was around software, right? And I use PowerPoint, for example, every day when I do trainings and when I do presentations, and it's really a way for me to organize stories, render it down into just a few bullet points so that it keeps me on track. But I don't think of that as being something that's a game changer. Excel, right, is for farmers, it's not very sexy, but I'll tell you, having a spreadsheet where you can put in real numbers, right? I've got a cash flow spreadsheet that I built myself. Well, my daughter helped me. She's a CPA, and she made it to where I could change metrics like price of grain and do scenarios, right? Where what happens if corn goes to $4.50, or what happens if corn goes to $7, and I can change that now real easily without going through every farm. But basically, it is a farm by farm spreadsheet that looks at profitability of each farm. And I think that most growers are like me. They probably, when they think about investing in a new piece of equipment, they think about their expenses. They kind of let the good farms carry the bad farms, right? They really don't want to know how bad the bad farms are, and it's probably not in their best interest to be conscious of how good, how easy their good farms are, right? So we kind of smoothie it over. But I'm telling you, it is sobering when you put real numbers, real yields on every farm. What you'll discover really quickly is that it has nothing to do, because by the way, this didn't just look at profitability, it looks at the expense side and it looks at the income side. And I'm telling you, the single biggest factor is, without question, yield, right? You cannot save enough money on a crappy piece of ground. You cannot save enough money. You cannot, you can't fix it, right? Unless you can improve the yield, right?
Yeah.
That is the secret ingredient. And, when we talk about it in the field, it's got to be climate, right? It's not the climate field view. It's the climate field view cab version, right? That's been a game changer for me, because I'm just really not good in the heat of battle of making good records, right? And so if you're keeping track of your what you planted where on a notebook in your shirt pocket, which is the way we did it for years, right? I'm not saying you don't have the data recorded, but it's highly unlikely that will ever equate to any meaningful, right? It's very unlikely, unless you plant fields with one variety. It's probably not likely that's going to work itself into really meaningful data. That field view cab, it is the money, right? It takes you now. Granted, early in the season, the first field or two you pull into, or when you first change varieties, it takes 5 minutes maybe to put in the data, to get it started. And 5 minutes when a planter's sitting still seems like 2 hours.
Yeah.
But after you get started, it doesn't take any length of time at all, right? Basically, you change the field, and it knows what's in the right half of the planter, the left half of the planter. It gives you population data. It gives you, and the money is when you get there in the fall with the combine, you don't have to try to remember. You don't have to dig your notebook out and say, well, I know it's these two hybrids, but which one is which, right? There's none of that. It knows spatially exactly where you're at, and it records that data spatially as you go through the field, the yield data. And it's crazy accurate. It's actually more accurate than my John Deere monitor is using the same metrics. And I don't know what the difference is in the algorithms, but it is really unique. And it's really changed the way I look at products, right? Used to, I'd go through the field and I'd say, yeah, this product is better than this product, right? But now when you get the real data, sometimes they're much closer than what you really thought. And the other neat thing is you can carve areas out, right? So sometimes we're very superstitious as a whole. I'm talking about humans, not just farmers, but we're all pretty superstitious as a whole. And if one variety, for example, falls into the worst part of the field, you automatically want to condemn that variety, right? Or maybe even that brand. And what you'll find is
your salesman.
And your salesman, right? You want to throw him under the bus. That's right. Your poor measly little life agronomist. Poor agronomist. He gets kicked too, right? Actually, he doesn't get kicked by the grower. He gets kicked by the seller, right? It's the kick the dog syndrome.
I learned it by watching you.
When you can draw in an area on the map, a Bayer is probably going to they're probably going to be beside themselves, right, hearing me talk about their product. But when you draw in that area on a map, whether it's a trapezoid or a circle, or maybe you just freeform an area, it's like, you know what, let's throw the bad areas out. Let's just look at the stuff that really makes this farm. And that thing gives you the varieties that you have planted. Maybe you switched and you went from 2 varieties to 3 varieties in that area. You get metrics on how many acres of each one of those varieties, what did they yield, what was the moisture, what percentage of that hybrid was on a Selma, and what percentage of it was on a Vincent's, or what percentage was on a Zip. It even gives you the soil types. It is absolutely a game changer. Now, obviously, you have to have spatial technology underneath that, right? We could talk about John Deere's or Case IH's or Ravens. We could talk about spatial technology, the auto steer and that sort of thing. But man, if you're just using auto steer, if the only good you're getting out of that is nice straight lines across the field, then you're not using that technology to its potential, because its real potential is to use that to mark you spatially in the field and help you be a better manager of information so you can make better decisions in the winter, right?
Well, that 5 minutes doesn't sound like it's very long whenever you think of all you can do with it, the 5 minutes it takes to put the data in right the first time.
Yeah, well, that's only the first time, right?
Yeah.
The first time, you're right. It's like, well, how do I get how to get this variety? You maybe have the varieties are on the wrong side of the planter, right? And that first time, every time it's like, well, gee, how do I get those back and forth? And then once you figure it out, it's like, oh, next time it doesn't take you any length of time at all. But yeah, we're as a whole, we get pretty. Well, there's just a lot of anxiety because there's so much at stake, right? People that don't farm don't understand that even a modest, even a hobby farmer might have $1 million in revenue, right? I mean, there is a huge amount of money at stake, and it's hard not to be filled with anxiety when you go to the field, because, it may look like a no-brainer. And typically when we get into May, it becomes, much easier to make decisions. But when it's the first part of April and the weather forecast is not particularly great, and maybe the ground's a little bit early, and I'm telling you, those decisions can have a huge impact at the end of the year. And they did, right? And yet we have all kinds of consultants telling you, oh, I just plant that, real nonchalant, right? That's a consultant that you might want to steer away from.
Yeah, I don't know. I had that conversation with a couple of growers this spring. It's like, I don't know. I've never seen the ground look like this in early April before. So I think my recommendation would be to go. I mean, they don't look for me for recommendations anymore, but but they certainly don't want to hear that. Well, you might as well do it early so you got time to do it again. That's probably not good either.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's exactly the kind of,
I didn't figure you could say that any better.
No, you can't say it any better. The only way you can say it better maybe is and this tainted my view of this spring, right? A lot of times it has to do with what happened to you the previous year, or maybe the previous couple of years. I can tell you that last year, it's like, I'm not going to plant in the mud in April, but I ended up planting in the mud in June, right? And that's much worse.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
When you have a year like that, then it taints you And you know what? It's easy to consult on stuff that you don't have. If you're not invested in it, it's much easier to consult. However, I can tell you as a consultant, you are much more objective, right? When the weather forecast is terrible and you've only got one day ahead of a great big, what's forecasted to be a toad strangler, then it's very easy to be as an agronomist to say, hey, objectively, this is probably not the time to go slam a bunch in the ground, right? But to a grower who's saying, man, oh man, I got shut out last year. I want to make a motion. I don't want to be the last one done. Then anxiety and, it's less objective then, right? And so that's probably enough said. My anxiety level's going up just thinking about it.
Sounds like you're stressing yourself out.
That's been the longest answer to the question of the day we've had, I think.
That was good.
I'm sorry.
That's
You're
good.
good.
Well,
You're good.
Well, we've kind of gone off into the next topic, and that's really what's going on in the field. And, I would tell you this. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna follow up and lead you down that path to say we planted some awesome looking ground in April, and then it got cold and it got wet, and so we'll lead you down that path. But go ahead and finish your thought for sure.
Yeah. So, well, I'll just start right there. Those folks that planted in early April, because the ground was really fit. That almost trumps weather. I mean, if you can go into really good environments and you don't just get pounded immediately. The old timers said that if corn lays in dry ground 3 days, it'll about always come up, and that is true. Now, when you plant early and you have suboptimal temperatures, the caveat of cool temperatures is not that the corn doesn't come up. That's not the problem. The problem with cool temperatures or suboptimal temperatures is that it comes up erratically, right? It's temporal variability. But, if I was a grower and I looked at my stand and I planted early April, and maybe I was a half a leaf collar or maybe had one leaf collar difference, I would call that pretty good. I think that's success. There's several folks that have data on that. You can look at university data and it would suggest that, yeah, there's an impact having temporal variability. And then you can look at like Precision Plantings data and it would suggest that if you have any temporal variability, it's just an absolute train wreck. And I think that's exaggerated, right? They probably exaggerate that because it helps them sell maybe more attachments. Not that we don't need the attachments, but I think they probably exaggerate the losses from temporal variability. But I have been totally surprised this year when you see not the way the good ground went in, but there was a lot of ground that was still pushed. And there was a lot of ground that was in cover crops that didn't get burnt down timely. And, I would consider some of the conditions less than optimal. And we had really cold weather. And yet the stands are pretty good. In fact, on soybeans, I think when you look at these soybean stands, Ryan, the first thing that comes to mind is, man, that's really a good stand of soybeans. And you know what that means almost every time? That means they're too thick, right? If you're looking at soybeans when they first come up and they look really good, that's probably a sign that they're too dead burn thick. So, I mean, I guess I would finish it this way. It's totally surprising how good the stands look this year because of the cool temperatures. But the soybeans have come up miraculously well, and even corn has come up with very little temporal variability, and spatial variability has been excellent, right? And part of that's because of seed treatments. Part of that's because they breed our corn to have excellent vigor. If they don't have excellent vigor, nothing makes it to commercialization, right?
Right.
Because the majority of acres are I would say the majority of acres now are probably some form of conservation tillage, right? I just came through the bottoms. I went through this morning. Basically, I've been through the White River bottoms, the Patoka River bottoms, and the Wabash bottoms. And it's amazing how much overflow ground is not being worked, right? It's being burnt down and being no-till. And that's surprising on that kind of ground. I mean, you expect, you're in Lawrence County, right? So we got Premier, which is pretty wide, right? They cover a pretty wide swath, and they go from some of the best ground in Davis County all the way over to Rush County, Shelby County. And you expect those areas to work some ground. In between, you would expect in all that hilly, rough ground that we have in between, you would fully expect them to no-till that. But when you get into these creek bottoms, river bottoms, and guys have adopted and learned how to manage conservation tillage in that environment, that really says something, right? I think people are finally adapting or adopting. They've adopted the idea, they've adopted the technology, and they've adapted to make it work, right? Because the first time you do it, it probably is not that successful, right? You learn that, hey, if I want to put a cover crop on this wet natured ground, it's got to be burn off early, right? I can't go in there and plant it green when it's dead high and expect to have a stand that's, vigorous and uniform and that sort of thing. But no, the crop I think is in excellent shape. There's some perils, right? We've got a period of 4 days of rain. Some places have had a little rain and are wet again. If you've got lots of residue and lots of cover, doggone it, those slugs, they don't go away on their own, right? And when you get into cool weather and they can start venturing out from their safe harbor in residue or just below the soil surface and get up on the crop, boy, they can make it go away really quickly. So, I would tell you, if we go into a period of, a week of overcast conditions, rainfall, even if light rainfall, you might want to pay real close attention to your stands. And if they look like you've got stand that's just disappearing, that's probably slugs, and you need to probably be out there. I can tell you to the west of us, they've got true armyworm already. There's been some black cutworm. Of course, we always have black cutworm, but when true armyworms come in, and it's that time of year, right? Wheat's headed, you'll have it oftentimes start in wheat fields or start in ditches or start in non-crop areas. And when they move across a bean field or more commonly a cornfield, man, they can wreak havoc in a hurry. So I would probably look out for, if I had a grower, if I was done and I was, interested, which I'm not done, but I'm interested in keeping a good crop, I would keep really close tabs on the critters, right? Make sure you don't have any slug problems, and make sure you don't have any armyworm or black cutworm problems. And then the next thing on the horizon is making sure you get this crop cleaned up well when it's the right time, right? I hate to see corn get up to V4, V5, and then cleaned up, right? We've got off to a nice start. Let's go in there at V2, V3, at the latest V4, and let's get our residuals on. Let's kill weeds when it's time to kill weeds, and then let's come back and jack them up with nutritionals and fungicide and that sort of thing maybe a little later when we get closer to grain growth.
Yeah, and you had the interns in yesterday all day. You had them in the boardroom for training, for some agronomy training, and then you had them out in the field in the afternoon. And those are some of the topics that you were talking about with bringing them up to speed with some of the things that they'd be seeing out there as they're getting deployed out to do the scouting, and they've got brand new iPads to take pictures of what they find in the field. And with the quality of photographs we have today, they can send those back, and once you've seen slug damage once or twice, you're pretty much an expert on it, aren't you, Glenn? You can identify it pretty quick after that.
Yeah, so I'd have a call out to Jeff Davis. He sent me a photograph yesterday. Excuse me. He sent me a photograph yesterday, and it was a a chunk of soil, right? And it was obviously from the eastern side of the territory. he told me where it was at. It's like, man, that looks like that's out of the Muscatatuck bottoms. And basically it was, really tight ground, and it'd come up in a big chunk, and here were slugs all over it. And I was
wow.
Yeah, I said, I'm surprised you didn't find something that looked like leeches that are 2 inches long down in the soil, because that's really common on those types of soils. And then he confirmed, yeah, he had seen some of those, right, where these slugs get enormous, and they don't really have to go above ground to hurt you. They basically, on that kind of ground, it's often to have kind of a seed trench. Even if it got pinched shut at the top, it's hollow underneath the surface, and they will make a living going down that seed trench, taking out the seed, taking out the mesocotyl and the root system, and they can wreck a corn stand in just a hurry. In this case, it was soybeans, and they were, I think they were, like I said, slug damage, you recognize it because it's like the disappearing crop, right? They don't leave carcasses. So you don't see cut plants. I mean, they're just gone. It's almost like aliens beamed them up, right?
And there's no good answer, right? I mean, we'd like to think there is, but other than some dry weather and sunshine, there's no remedy.
You're exactly, well, there is.
There is, but there's not. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, they're not very well. There's one that's really successful, and that's tillage. Well, if you've got slugs, it's probably because you're trying not to practice tillage. Yep. But that's one time when you submit, right? You say, okay, I'm a conservation farmer, but I'm going to get a tillage tool out and I'm going to cut this open because that is the surest way to get rid of them, right? And it doesn't mean you have to use it every year, but when you have slugs, that's a good way to do it. The other thing is obviously there's a couple different products like metaldehyde or the trade name is Deadline, right? And those products work okay. They're baits. They're fairly expensive for the level of efficacy you get.
Yeah.
But there's probably one other thing I better share before I get off here because I know you guys don't want to be on all morning. It's what do we do if we have a failed crop on corn, right? That's a question every year. We've got a crop, it's up, it's sporadic, it's maybe got gaps, there's for whatever reason, maybe you had slugs. Well, how do we terminate it and go back to corn? Well, the first, traditionally there's been 3. Now there's actually 4 ways to terminate corn, right? Number 1 is tillage again, right? I would go in, field cultivate it or disc it a couple times. Don't try to do it with a vertical tillage tool. You're just going to wallow them around, and those that were strong are going to survive, and then that's going to be a weed in the subsequent crop, right? So go in and do some kind of, really strong secondary tillage is probably number 1. Historically, we've used low rates of section, but the problem is that's really slow, and we're using such low rates. If you do that, right, that's using clethodim. Make sure you have lots of oil and lots of water. Make sure you get lots of coverage, and remember, you cannot go over those low rates. It's like 2 ounces, or you could potentially have issues with plant back restrictions, right? Corn, it does have soil activity, and you cannot go back to corn if you go over that threshold. In fact, you can't go back to green sorghum at all. The third method has always been to use gramoxone and metribuzin. And again, it looks pretty nuclear, and it you think you've killed it, but oftentimes because the growing point is below ground and corn is pretty resilient when it's small, you end up having a redo, or you end up having a significant amount of survivors. And then we have a new product that one of my peers tested. He demoed it last year quite a bit, and that's the Helm product called Reviton. And that may be the fit for Reviton, right? We were going to try to use it as a burn down product, and it's a little weak on mare's tail, and so it never really caught traction. But for terminating corn, guys, it is excellent. And the rate is like 1 to 2 ounces, and even at 1 ounce, it was very deadly on corn. So keep that in your hip pocket. Ask your premier account rep if you have some corn that you want to terminate and replant, and tell them you heard about a product called Reviton, and I think that would be an excellent tool to terminate a suboptimal state.
Well, good deal. Well, I think that you're going to be busy today, and you're trying to probably get some crops in the ground too, but we had some big news. You actually started full-time with Premier Ag as our agronomist. We've been sharing you with Winfield United, or Winfield United has been sharing you with us, but now we're selfish, and you are 100% Premier Ag. So welcome aboard, Glenn.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm tickled to death.
Ryan, that's all I've got. Do you have anything else?
I do not. Glenn, get back to work.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right. That's another episode of the High Ground, powered by Premier Companies. If you like what you hear, please like and subscribe, and find us anywhere you find your favorite podcast. Thanks.